Anyway, my name is Rusty Heckman. As you can tell right there where I'm signed in, I'm the research room supervisor at the Kentucky Department for Library and Archives. I'm fortunate enough to get to work with researchers like yourselves on a daily basis, where I try to assist them in their research needs, in particular with the resources that are available to them at KDLA. For anyone that's not familiar with what those resources include, it is about, at this point, I think 125,000 cubic feet of original paper records and over 70,000 rolls of microfilm. These records include deed books, marriage records, will books, tax lists, circuit and appellate court case files, census and military records, and records for many state agencies, including the governor's office. However, most importantly to our needs today are the records that have to do with vital records, or records of birth, marriage, and death. In particular, birth and death is what I'll be focusing on. These records I'll be discussing together. We'll review what exactly vital records are, to what purpose they were created, and their value to you as the researcher and the genealogist. In the process of doing so, we're going to be covering the history of vital record keeping and registration in Kentucky, the records available at KDLA in particular, and then alternatives to those records when those are not available, and then access to both the alternatives and the records at KDLA. If you are an experienced researcher, some of this might be review. However, despite your level of familiarity, I think there's going to be a lot of context that we'll cover that's going to give you a fresh perspective on any of your searches. So I'm going to jump right in now with the what, why, and how. We all know the importance of the documentation of births and deaths, especially in modern life. Birth certificates are required to apply for Social Security, to enroll in school, procure employment, and are often necessary for enrollment in many other benefits. Death certificates prove to be just as vital for family members that are left behind, who find themselves in need of official documentation for accessing pension benefits, life insurance claims, estate settlements, getting married to someone new, making funeral arrangements, or even by the officials that are investigating your death. Together, these records provide documentation of proof of life. For an individual, they establish important facts such as a given name, date of birth, place of birth, residence, parents' names, an individual's age, sex, race, and more. They're an essential element to any genealogical research, and to anyone familiar with the genealogical research, they're also can be a very elusive element. The scarcity of what's easily available for what we assume is an essential document can be alarming to a lot of people. So the context that we're going to be covering will hopefully give you some idea of why that scarcity exists. Keeping records of significant life events, such as birth and marriage and death, was customarily a role played by the church in English history. This dates back as early as 1538, when this role was a requirement for weekly registration of christenings and marriages and even burials by the church with all parishes in England. The Grand Assembly of Virginia brought this expectation to America in 1632. When they passed a law requiring a minister or warden from every parish to appear annually at court, again, for the same reason, to register those events. You're going to hear me say registration or register a lot. It's important to note this. The certificates that we often associate with life events like birth and death is much more of a modern creation. In the past, it was definitely more expected that there would be a registration, or basically a list of these events. The importance of records for legal proceedings. So I should note that at the early point, the reason they were being kept was they were statements of fact. They were often used in the protection of individual rights, particularly for your protection of property and estate. Because of this and the value that they had for legal proceedings, the shift of focus began to kind of take place from that of the church as the record keeper to the state. That's reflected as early as 1639, when the colony of Massachusetts passed the legislation that you can see quoted here. That was followed suit by Connecticut and Plymouth, as well as many others. And then all the other colonies and states that were shortly established. Legislation continued to be passed throughout that time and amended over the next century and a half, calling upon typically government officials like town clerks or administrators to administer, the acquisition and recording of this information. Now, none of the early registration laws proved to be very effective. So even though there might be something on the books for registering these events as early as 1639 in some places, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to find records or very comprehensive records back that far. In a lot of cases, the reasoning behind the law was still primarily protection of property right. Again, it served as justification for the collection of the information, but it rarely motivated the population to actually do the registering. This is particularly true for a population that was hearkening the call to Western frontier, and especially in smaller communities that had bigger priorities and few resources to commit to the task of registering. This began to change with the public health movement. So far from the frontier, new discoveries for the application of the records were being realized and collected in the old world. Mathematicians in England and on the European continent discovered that through analysis of the records that were being documented, that they could discern patterns. One of the first was astronomer Edmund Halley, who demonstrated this through the development of the first life expectancy table. That was back in 1693. Cotton Mather, a name more familiar with some of us, applied this here in the States. Was one of the first statistical use of the records when he noted the impact of a severe smallpox epidemic in Boston. And he was comparing those inoculated to those that weren't, and this was in 1721. His examples showed that the registration efforts, these examples showed that the registration efforts being made in parallel to local health and sanitary revelations. Though initially unconnected, health reformers eventually saw the value of the statistics and records that were being collected, and they would become pretty strong advocates for stronger legislation to require further documentation of these life events. For Kentucky, this inspired a local by the name of Lemuel Shattuck in Fayette County. It was Dr. Sutton in Fayette County. Lemuel Shattuck was in Massachusetts. He inspired Dr. Sutton, who began advocating for state legislation of the registration of births, marriages, and deaths in 1850. Through the influence of the medical association that he'd established, which was the Kentucky State Medical Society, he created that in 1851 as the first president. He eventually succeeded with the passing of Kentucky's first registration law, and that was in 1852. Arguments made by himself were kind of echoed by Jas Shepherd, who you can see quoted here. If you want to read the entire quote, I'll let you. I'm not going to read it to you, but of particular note are the two arguments being made kind of in concert with each other. Again, you can see rights of heirs at law, reflecting the arguments that we discussed earlier about the necessity of these records for preserving your legal claims. But you can also see, start to see the arguments being made for public health needs as well. So the Sutton Act, like I said, was passed in 1852, or went into effect in 1852. It was Kentucky's first registration law. It demonstrates the culmination of thought regarding record keeping of this nature, taking into account arguments used leading up to the 1850s, and joining a national and global movement to ensure that documentation of these life events was taking place. Prior to this legislation in 1851, there was no state authority that was involved in the registration of life events like these. Kentuckians, like those before him, instead had to rely upon the church or family to document this. And that's also where you would have to turn in order to find birth or death records prior to 1852 in Kentucky. You'd hope to find existing church christenings or burials, or maybe a family journal that was recording these events. A lot of times a family Bible might be a good source as well. However, beginning in 1852, the state called upon local clergymen, physicians, surgeons, and midwives to keep a registry of births and deaths at which they had previously attended. They were to deposit their registries with the county clerk at the beginning of each year. Clerks were then instructed to make lists of the births, marriages, and deaths to have occurred. Sorry about that. Clerks were to make lists of the records that occurred in their county based on these registries and upon inquiries to all heads of families. Upon completion, the clerk then submitted the information to the state auditor, who in turn created a report for the legislature, the state assembly. Usually in his report, the auditor noted, at least in the first year, that although there are many imperfections and some very gross negligence, yet altogether the enterprise thus far has been eminently successful. In all cases, the assessor had to depend on the memory of the head of the family, who in multitude of instances was not necessarily the head of the family at all, or whose knowledge of the event was limited, or perhaps had not even attended the event in person. And that leads us to the challenges experienced with the first registration law. The auditor continued to note the impossibility of the task of completing the duties assigned his office. He procured the services of Dr. Sutton, kind of the author of the law anyway, to kind of assume responsibility for registration on the state instead. Despite, or perhaps due to this, Dr. Sutton's passion for the project, he could not help but note the challenges associated with collecting accurate data and the incompleteness of the records being made. He summarized this with the following: the causes which had made some of the returns defective in his second annual report listed the following: the indifference of the people, the carelessness and neglect of the assessors, and the inadequate compensation given the assessors for the tasks assigned. Some of the challenges faced are illustrated here with the example on the page. This one's pulled from the Lincoln County Birth Registration Book, the original one from 1852. You can see pieces missing and notes like those highlighted. The Lincoln County clerk notes that the date of this child's birth was forgotten by the father. Now I am the father of two, and I can tell you that my wife would not be happy if I forgot the birth date of her child. But if I had to recall it this time, I don't know if I would be any more successful than this individual. Now, when the family member, clergyman, or midwife was finally in the county seat to submit the information to the county clerk, it was often challenging to recall specifics. There was no centralized location where these events were frequently taking place, like a hospital in today's age. Childbirth was still an event that was most frequently experienced in the family's home. Births and deaths were not tracked until the information was volunteered to the appropriate authority. An authority who then, who until the passing of this act had already had a plethora of other responsibilities, and who, with the addition of this act, did not see any addition to his compensation. And you can expect his lack of motivation as a result of that. Dr. Sutton conceded all of these points in his annual reports, where he regularly called out the carelessness of the documentation produced by the clerks and the assessors, and each year listed the counties that were completely negligent in reporting anything. The causes of death were particularly suspect, having come from men with no medical training, and even such facts as race and sex were sometimes difficult to determine from the information provided. For example, in Owen County, returns from 1853, they only included initials of the given name and had no indication of gender. The official duties of the registration were passed to a state registrar finally in 1859, when the act was amended for the appointment of this position. The first state registrar was Dr. Samuel Dennis, who accepted the position, and like Dr. Sutton before him, kind of enumerated the difficulties experienced in collecting the data in his tasks. His frustration culminated in 1861 when the annual report, he declared that no apology for a deficiency like that which has occurred could be made. This was in review of returns from Jefferson County. In review of those returns, he had noted a failure to document over 1,200 deaths. That was just one example from a county of negligence. And after kind of applying that case study to the state, he went on to estimate that there was a loss of at least a third of births and nearly half of the deaths that occurred annually. And this was pretty much true of all the years of the registration, which was originally from 1852 to 1862. Despite records that exist, you can expect that at least half of those were not documented at all. In this example from Carter County, you can see some more examples that might have drawn Dr. Sutton's ire. Causes of death were attributed to the flux with alarming regularity, or in the top line to want of breath without reference to any underlying illness or injury. On a more humorous note, you can also find remarks by the clerk. In this case, the Carter County clerk noted that the wife was glad of the passing of the spouse. I can only reflect that perhaps this was a spouse that forgot their child's birth date as well. Despite its shortfalls, the registration law received acclaim and praise from many medical journals. You can see some examples here. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal wrote that the report as a whole shows very promising beginning and reflects much credit on Dr. Sutton, while also noting that some dozen or more states now have registration laws. And we're glad to learn that the subject was actually in successful operation west of the Alleghenies. This was from the National Journal of Medical and Surgery, which added that people slow to believe in the use of careful registration of facts. The state of Kentucky is the only one west of the Alleghenies which has yet profited sufficiently by the lesson of the older countries to carry out such a regular registry. Recognition of the value of the registration of vital records was not as forthcoming from within the state as out. In the 1855 session of the Kentucky legislature, an effort was made to repeal the act. Though it failed, it demonstrated the lack of popular support for registration and reflected the poor participation experienced throughout the state. In 1862, pressures of war and the opportunity to save on the cost of administering the registration law led the Kentucky General Assembly to repeal the act. The Kentucky State Medical Society and Governor John Stevenson would recommend that the General Assembly reenact the registration laws in the late 1860s. That cause was then taken up by Governor Preston Leslie, who assumed office in 1871. Despite this, Kentucky would not officially require registration again until 1874. For most counties, you can find these records in 1864 between the time of the repeal of the original act in 1861 and the second act in 1874. However, there are no registries for those states. Here are some examples from Kenton County of the registries being generated in the 1870s. Like those before, they gather a lot of the similar information: dates, names, genders, locations, relationships. However, they also relied upon the same methods of collecting that data. Interviews with family heads of household, submitted information from local clergy, surgeons, midwives. Like those before him, the state auditor, Howard Smith, bemoaned the additional duties assigned to his office. In addition to the challenges of guaranteeing accuracy highlighted by Dr. Sutton before him and others engaged with registration, Mr. Smith drew particular attention to the costs accrued by his office for administering the law and the lack of compensation accounted for it. This culminated in his report in 1877 when he asked that he be relieved of his work for the future, or that such an appropriation be made that will enable him to have it done without imposing undue labor on him or his subordinates. His request was granted. When in that same year, the General Assembly repealed the act, requiring registration and instead established a state board of health. In the course of establishing this board of health, they assigned them, among other responsibilities, the authority over registration of vital records. The shift in oversight illustrates the growing association of registration with public health as opposed to individual right and property protection. So they assumed responsibility in 1878. Reports starting in 1879 and 1880 by the Board of Health include a lot of the same complaints as reflected in earlier authorities of registration. They were experiencing the same difficulties in administering the task, and were in particular got frustrated with the inherent errors in the collection by those individuals who were not medically trained. The reports from the Board of Health as far as registration goes kind of disappeared after the 1880s, as well as the returns themselves. Despite the fact that there's legislature that exists that shows that there's still it was still on the books and a requirement of the Board of Health, we don't really have a lot of returns at all through the 1880s and 1890s. Registration would not be revisited again until 1910, when the Bureau of Vital Statistics was formed, and the modern collection of vital records began with the passage of vital statistics law in Kentucky and went into effect in 1911. Between 1852 and 1862, and again between 74 and 78, birth and death records were kept irregularly by county assessors. The degree of completeness varies greatly from county to county. The practice was continued even more sporadically across scattered counties after 1880, resulting in few records from the 1890s through 1910, in particular after 1900. Of the records that were created throughout this time, it is presumed that they were kept in the auditor's office in the old State House. This office was relocated to the current Capitol in 1909, along with the returns from 74 and 78. The larger portion of records remained in the old State House, which was later occupied by the Kentucky Historical Society in 1920. KHS preserved the collection until 1976, when the records were transferred to the State Archives, or KDLA, where they are today. Meanwhile, in 1936, officials in the Capitol were seeking to make space and were actively disposing of many older records. This would likely have included returns from the 1870s, had not Dr. Thomas Clark, who you see pictured here, and James Martin from the University of Kentucky made arrangements to have the records transferred to the University of Kentucky instead. They were reunited with those other records of registration at the State Archives when transferred here in 1976 as well. It remains unclear what happened to the returns submitted to the State Board of Health during its tenure in the late 1870s to the early 1900s. So that's what exists. As far as accessing what exists, I'm going to navigate away from the PowerPoint and share a different page instead. Yes, we all know we're in Zoom. Sorry, I can't see the top of my page. What I'm trying to get to is this. This is the home page for KDLA. This is where you might go to start your exploration of what records that we have. It's not necessarily intuitive, but you would click on order records first in order to get to an inventory, which is here. So if you didn't see where I first clicked, it was in this kind of blue box with the bullet points. The 8th bullet point is order records. You can also get to that under researchers, how to request records from the archive. Scrolling down, there's a records inventory, which is a link we tried to share. The link wasn't working. I think Sierra corrected that though. But if not, this is how you would get to it. Get rid of that. This is what you would see, and it's an inventory by county. There's 120 counties. Of those 120 counties, these are the records most often requested in the custodial care of KDLA. In particular, for our purposes, the birth and death records. And you can just kind of see as you scroll through what years are available as far as registration is concerned for those counties. For your particular interests, Kenton County, or probably even Campbell for some people, you can see what dates we have here. Perhaps Boone County. Again, this is what we have. Oftentimes, even though you see a lot of miscellaneous dates, they usually fall within that range: 1852, 61, 74, 78. And if anything else is available, it's typically the late 1890s to early 1900s. Kenton County is down here. Here you can see those dates better reflected. And it really is very hit or miss. In addition to the records that are listed here by county, if you go back to this page where we got to the inventory and scroll down, you can see this birth records request. And you can click this link, the second one. It says a list of birth records 1852 to 1910 available by city. In addition to what was being recorded by the state, a few of the larger cities in Kentucky took it upon themselves to record vital records as well. And those included Covington, Lexington, Louisville, and Newport. And from here you can see from those cities here we go, Covington, what is available in what dates. Any of these records are on microfilm. That's why there's a roll number associated with them on this list, and can be viewed in the research room of KDLA. For anyone not familiar, we're located in Frankfort, 300 Coffee Tree. If you can't make the commute down here, you can also request us to search the records and send you anything that we find. And that's from the same page where you're accessing the inventories. So it's always a great idea to check the inventory, confirm that we have something, and then if we do have something, either schedule an appointment to come down and visit us in person, where we'll gladly assist you, or start the process by clicking this link of ordering one of those records. For any Kentucky residents, it's a $10 fee per record request. For anyone attending today that might be outside of the state of Kentucky, it's $15. But it's still the same process as far as clicking into here, identifying the record that you want ordered, and then following the steps. Now, one thing to note before you submit an order and pay us to do the search is a lot of these things are actually available on Family Search. I'm not going to say they're all available by any means, but for anyone that isn't familiar with Family Search, or perhaps you only do general searches on here, one thing I always try to point out to people is the catalog search. So when you go to Family Search, you do have to set up an account. It's free, but from there you can access this catalog. And from here you can indicate what place that you're searching in, and rather than searching by name. So for example, Kenton County. You'll get a result like this, which lists what is available by that specific county. On the bottom of this list, you'll see vital records. You can drop that down to see a little more detail. So you can see birth, marriages, and deaths. Well, oftentimes this something that's listed like this is going to reflect what's on our microfilm. Again, it might not be everything that we have, but in some cases it might be. I'm just going to open one up so you can get a better idea of what it looks like. Once you open it up, it's going to give you more specifics about what dates are available. Again, you see those dates that we've been talking about, 52 to 59. Typically, there's something in the 1870s. In this case, there's not. And then again, in the early 1900s. Now, if this is something that you wanted to see, ideally, you're going to see this kind of camera icon, and that allows you to view it online. You have to be signed in to access it. But it'll take you to a page like this, where you can see the scanned images. And a lot of times, if you're lucky, I don't think they're typically indexed. See something like this, kind of a title page. It gives you an idea of what's on here, and you can kind of scroll through and see, just like we were talking about, a list. Oftentimes it's not alphabetical or any kind of organization to it. It's just by what was reported and when to the kind of local assessor, the county assessor. With that in mind, some births in particular got reported to an assessor years afterward. So you might know that a birth took place in a particular year and you're not finding it. It's a good idea to check additional years to see if it just happened to be reported after the fact. A lot of these reels, as was noted on the previous page, have multiple registry lists on them. So this was births. This is the last page. Yeah, this starts the next one, 1854. So just keep that in mind as you're scrolling through to keep going to get to the particular records that are of interest to you. Now, let me share one more thing that you all should have access to. It's just this handout, and this just kind of summarizes a lot of what I've covered as far as the dates that are available at KDLA, the fact that they exist as well, not just for counties, but for cities. One thing I didn't note that you probably all are aware of, but if not, is that after 1911, custody of these records, in particular birth records, is with the Office of Vital Statistics. So it's not something that we have access to. Instead, you have to contact them with this number here in order to start the request for access to that record. We do have death records up to 1965, 1966, however, so that's something that you can still contact KDLA about or come to us for research. After that, though, again, you have to go to the Office of Vital Statistics. The background is something that you all are hopefully more familiar with now, but it's something that you can refer back to this to get a little more information. And then we also make some recommendations on other places to consider if you're not getting results from those records that are referenced here. Places like the Kentucky Historical Society, your local or regional history or genealogical group, of course, your local library, and then the Office of Vital Statistics. All right, I'm gonna go back to the slides, just a couple more things to cover, and I'll gladly take questions. Oh, here, I can't see. There we go. All right. Scrolling down to where we left off. So let's say the record that you need falls either before the dates that are available or perhaps even within the dates that are available but are perhaps not covered by the county that you're looking in. There's some alternative sources that you can refer to, things like church records that are typically going to be available at other institutions like Kentucky Historical Society or regional groups or the church itself. Same with family records. These are not records that are collected by KDLA. We are the state repository for state records. So if it's not generated by the state, we typically do not have it represented in our collections. You might also try to track down cemetery or funeral home records, census records, which we do have available, and then school census as well. City registries for larger metropolitan areas in Kentucky are a good source. Newspapers, which might include obituaries and death notices, tax lists, deeds, or even wills and probate records. One thing I didn't note on here, but I should point out our court records, which probate records falls within, but even beyond that, court records, which are again at KDLA, are another great source that's often overlooked, and you can find references to life events, in particular death, when estates have to be settled. So those are another great resource that you want to keep in mind. And one other thing is delayed births. So anyone born prior to 1911 registration law, because verification or birth prior to this point was very hit or miss, but after this point became increasingly essential to life in modern society. They, in particular with Social Security and passports, excuse me. You could apply for what was called a delayed birth certificate. And in the course of applying, you had to prove your birth, basically. So obviously you're alive, you were born, but you have to prove the facts of your birth, who you were born to, when and where. And often this included a lot of supporting documentation, which might include things like oaths of a family member or a longtime acquaintance, a federal or school census, family Bible or family physician's record, marriage record, voter registration, military records, church baptisms, etc. All these applications are kept by the Office of Vital Statistics, which issued the delayed birth certificates. So this list includes births as early as the 1850s, although that's exceedingly rare. Most of them, I'd say the bulk of them are from the late 1890s through the early 1900s up to 1911. We at KDLA do have an index to these records, so it's something you can contact us to search to confirm that a delayed birth exists for an individual, but we can't get you access to it. Instead, we would have to refer you to the Office of Vital Statistics to actually access the record after we've confirmed it exists. So in conclusion, it's my hope that by knowing the why, when, and what vital records, that you'll have a better perspective when searching for your family's history. The context we've covered will help inform your search by helping you to understand if that search should be conducted with the records available at KDLA or the Office of Vital Statistics, or with local organizations like the Kenton County Public Library. I'm happy to take questions. I know we covered a lot, so let me first stop sharing the screen so I can see you all, if anybody is sharing their camera.